Welcome to the latest episode of the Lownie Report. We'll be reviewing what's been happening over the last month, including the relations within the York family and stories that Eugenie has cut ties with her father. We'll be looking at the release of the Epstein files, or rather the lack of release of the Epstein files. And we'll be looking at Andrew's move from Royal Lodge, which seems to have been hastened.
So let's start on Andrew's move. So what's your take on the speed of the move now from Royal Lodge? So it's so fast that he might even be staying in Wood Farm while Marsh Farm is renovated. What do you think's behind this sudden acceleration of the plans?
It's very interesting to see the new headlines that Andrew is moving out by his 66th birthday, which is in a few weeks' time. Because I think my own feeling was that he would dig his heels in, he would stay until October, which was the deadline for him to leave. I think clearly pressure's been put on him. Presumably he's been given some extra money. I think because they see the optics of him staying in Royal Lodge don't look good. I mean, the palace want him out of there as quickly as possible and perhaps into the sort of less obvious media glare of Norfolk. The chances are that it's clearly taking time to prepare Marsh Farm. He may well move to Wood Farm briefly. But this is an interesting development. And the stories of him going to the Middle East, those stories seem to have quietened down now. So how far this is press manipulation and how far it's true is very hard to establish.
And talking of press manipulation, there was a quite a prominently placed article in the Daily Mail this week, written by a lady called Olivia Fain, which was essentially in defense of Prince Andrew. And her take was that you can't really blame Andrew for his actions because he's a royal and that's just kind of the life they live. What's your take on the appearance of that article? Do you think that might be part of a coordinated PR plan?
Yes, I think there is a coordinated plan. I mean, we're seeing it particularly through the Reach newspapers, who have been running stories both in OK, in the Mirror, and the Express, saying that he is a victim, he's been victimized, he's basically suffered enough, he's never really been charged with anything. And this has popped up over the years, and there have been lots of attempts to demonize Virginia Giuffre and anyone who writes about this case who's critical of Andrew. So yes, I think this is a PR thing. I mean, there's also the press likes to sometimes be a bit perverse and change its views and balance things. And they may be just trying to provoke a reaction. I mean, the piece didn't really say anything, except as you say, we need to make excuses for the royals because they're not like us. But I think they do need to take responsibility for their actions. I mean, in some ways more so than the ordinary person because they have all these privileges. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out and that's picked up. But there's clearly a whole series of different messages that are being pumped out at the moment to try and make Andrew more sympathetic. I think what's very interesting too is on Sarah Ferguson and where she goes. That's the big mystery. No one seems to know. She's gone under the radar. I know from talking to friends of hers that she's not in contact with a lot of her closest friends. But in some ways, she is the more interesting figure of the two because she is the one who we have no idea what she's going to do next.
So what do you think Sarah's tactic at the moment is? And can you take us through how she's been able to rehabilitate herself so successfully after scandal after scandal?
Well, I think her technique this time is to do what she's done before, which is probably to confess her sins, to make excuses. It's all down to her mother leaving at the age of 13 and her need to be a people pleaser. I think, though, she's running out of allies to feed that story. I mean, she had Oprah for a long time, and a lot of the American chat shows brought this stuff up. I think, now she's been seen to lied about her association with Epstein and when it ended. And I think just the way that she is grifted off the royal family, I think has turned people against her. So, I mean, places like Australia and America, where she would have got refuge in the past, I think are less likely to give her that refuge. But I know she's been talking to reputation managers. She's always got lots of these people around her. She's still hoping to make some breakthrough, but I can't see anyone buying any more children's books from her. I can't see her endorsing products. So it's difficult to know what she can do, whether she really carries any sort of moral authority to be a chat show host, which is what she's always wanted to do. So I think her options are a bit limited. And clearly, she's now going to have to fend for herself. We don't know what's happened to the money from the sale of those that £4 million house in Belgravia, whether that's money that goes to the daughters, whether the daughters are subsidizing her at the moment, whether Charles has paid her off. There's still lots and lots of negotiating through the press in terms of selling family items and writing kiss and tell books, which I don't think she's going to do. She's not going to do anything that jeopardizes the future of her daughters. So I think she's got some limited options, and it'll be interesting to see what happens.
And what kind of deal do you think she might be able to strike with the palace? Is it likely she might get an allowance for the rest of her life? She might get a lump sum. What kind of deal do you think she might be negotiating at the moment? And what kind of cards is she holding to get a good one?
I think Fergie does hold a number of cards. She knows where a lot of the bodies are buried, and they don't want that coming out. I think they don't want to appear to be vindictive towards her. People may feel some sympathy that, she's now been thrown out of her house. She's lost her previous means of earning some money. I don't think they'll give her a lump sum because she'll just spend it. And that was the problem with the divorce settlement. So I think she'll have some sort of allowance, which will keep her under control because it'll be signed to all sorts of obligations not to speak out. She did have NDAs under the divorce settlement, but she seems to have got round them at times. Certainly, I mentioned in my book that when Anna Starkey and John Bryan did their book, there's some suggestion she may well have helped them, which is extraordinary. So I think that there still may be stories that she will sort of drop into the press through her sort of sources, just to keep the royals on their toes. There's clearly a chess game going on, and it'll just be interesting to see who blinks first.
And what do we know about Eugenie's reported estrangement from Andrew?
Well, I took this story with a slight pinch of salt. I mean, the daughters have gone through all sorts of scandals that their parents have inflicted. I mean, perhaps the most serious was the 2010 Selling for Access story. They've stuck with the parents. I mean, they've been very loyal. I mean, they've been very loyal to the royal family. They've never criticized anyone. So I find it odd, but I mean, clearly is a personal thing here. Eugenie, I think, is part of this. I think is about distancing themselves from the parents because they're toxic and they damage the brand, the Eugenie and Beatrice brand. And if they are to stay within the royal family, if they're to continue to use their royal connections and their royal titles to make money, as we suspect is happening in the Middle East, then they kind of need to distance themselves from the parents. So I think that's pushing it more than any sense of disgust against the father's actions. I mean, nothing really has changed there. We know that he was involved with young women. We know that he's a liar. We know that he abused his position as a trade envoy. I mean, none of this is going to be a surprise to them. So it's difficult to see exactly what has changed, except the fact that he's lost his title and his home. I mean, there may be a certain amount of anger because he didn't need to lose Royal Lodge. If he had actually kept it, followed the lease and actually kept it looking spick and span, they couldn't have got rid of him and they would have had to pay him compensation. And clearly, the suggestion is that the daughter is expected to inherit Royal Lodge. He had it for 75 years, and it's worth huge sums of money. So he kind of blew that, and I'm not quite sure why he needed to, because I think he had the money to keep it repaired. So there may be some just a bit of fed upness that he's kind of blown it for them in the future, as well as any disgust they might have about his behavior. Unless they know things that we, the public, don't know, unless they know things that may be about to be revealed, and they're distancing themselves as a precautionary measure. But all this has to really be speculation. They are a tight bond family, and in some ways, if they're going to break with their father, they should be breaking with their mother too, because she's an equal embarrassment.
You cover Beatrice and Eugenie's upbringing in the book. Can you just give us an overview of what their upbringing was like, what their relationship with their parents was like, and the kind of world that they grew up in?
Well, in some ways, they were brought up by nannies and protection officers, and that may be why they're reasonably normal. The fact is that Andrew was away a large part of the time in the Navy, either on bases or at sea. The mother was away a lot. I mean, she would often spend weeks in the States, just flying back for the weekend. And so I think, it was a slightly, I would say, lonely childhood, not a conventional childhood, a bit of an ab-fab childhood because the mother was so kooky and weird. Lots and lots of being introduced to famous people, everyone from sexual predators like P. Diddy and Peter Nygard through to Harvey Weinstein and Epstein, but also, all sorts of stars. I mean, the children are sort of mixing in these circles themselves now, I mean, particularly close to the Branson family often went on holiday on the Abramovich yacht. So the parents like hanging out with the rich and famous, and they've passed that on to the children. And I think there was a lot of that, a lot of very nice, luxurious holidays and travel. One of the criticisms of the children as they grew up was just how much time they took away on holiday. I mean, clearly there was some boarding school. They went away to university. So there was some, again, distance from the parents at times of their life. But it is a close family. I mean, a lot of this, I think, is for the camera. But one of the things that emerged when I interviewed people was that Fergie likes to make out she's this great mum, lots and lots of pictures of her with the children. But actually, she kind of passed the children back to the nannies as soon as the photographers were gone. And, a slightly cynical playing off the happy families, I think. So there may be all sorts, as we're seeing with the Beckham family, all sorts of hidden tensions, which are only coming out now that they're grown up and perhaps can reassess their childhood.
And can you contrast Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie with their cousin?
Yes, I mean, Beatrice and Eugenie, I think, are quite close, were quite close to William and Harry, particularly Eugenie and Harry. I think the children of Zara and Peter Phillips, again, are quite close to them, same, similar sort of ages, similar sorts of interests. I mean, they live in the Cotswolds. I think the Edward relationship is more tricky because they're clearly much younger. Princess Louise is only, I think, in her early 20s, and the Earl of Essex is still at school. So I think that's slightly more distant. And I think also it reflects the relationship between the brothers. I mean, Andrew and Edward, though they were only a couple of years apart, are not that close. I mean, they're very different characters. So I think that the interesting relationship possibly is with William and Harry, because clearly their future of the children, of the York children, rests now with William. They need to keep in with William. And they need to be careful about antagonizing William, who's keen to clear out the stables and have a sort of clean break with some of the scandals of the past. So it's a delicate sort of balancing act at the moment.
But similarly to the Beckhams, with Andrew and Fergie, they made a choice, didn't they? That their children were to be princesses, that their children were to be HRH. And presumably they made a choice that their children would be relatively exposed to the media in a way that Anne's children weren't when they were growing up, or indeed Edward's when they were growing up.
Yes, I mean Andrew is always says that his daughters are princes of the blood, and they should be treated as granddaughters of the monarch. They should be treated well. He's always been very ambitious for them. They had police protection when they didn't really need it because it was all about status. He took them on a lot of his trips as a trade envoy. They were paid for by the taxpayer, really to help build their contact books, which of course they're now exploiting. So he was very ambitious for them, and he very much felt that they should be protected and cosseted and should be given the sort of privileges that he had. So as you say, very different from the way that Anne and Edward have behaved towards their children.
So, what do you see as the risks for Beatrice and Eugenie going forward?
Well, I think both Beatrice and Eugenie walk this very tight line between keeping in with the royal family and retaining their titles, being able perhaps to do some royal duties, which would give them extra kudos, which helps them with their business activities, because they are sort of half in, half out in a way that Meghan, I think, would like to be. At the same time, clearly there should be some loyalty to their parents, but they can see that if they get too close to them, it's going to be difficult for their own reputations and brand, quite apart from their relations with other members of the royal family. I think there's quite a lot of sympathy for them, the sense that they've been tainted by the parents' sins. And I think if material begins to emerge that they also have been abusing their position as the royals to make money for themselves, then that's going to change the public perception. I mean, my own advice to them is that they should basically lie low. They should be as squeaky clean as possible, concentrate on their careers and on their families, and basically hope that everyone begins to forget about them. But they like the extravagant life. They have reasonably rich husbands, but they always need more money. So the danger is that they repeat some of the mistakes their parents have made, and rather than cut loose as they should do, they kind of try and walk this line of still being in, half out.
So it was reported last week that Ghislaine Maxwell is going to testify at Congress, and also that the Clintons have refused and are going to be held in contempt of Congress. What are the implications here for Andrew and Fergie?
Well, I think they must be very worried because clearly Ghislaine Maxwell knows everything, and she could be very damaging to them. She's continuing to put the pressure in the hope of getting a pardon from Trump. It's pretty clear that she had access to material in the Epstein estate, and that's how some of the stuff was leaked to Daphne Barrack. And it's clearly the worry, it must be the worry that there's going to be more of these leaks. but quite apart from her own testimony. The Clinton thing is interesting because so far the line has been that his foundations were involved with Epstein, but he was completely innocent and didn't really know him. Now we're beginning to get pictures of him in swimming pools and with attractive young women, and it seems the relationship was slightly closer than he's let on. Certainly, my sources say that he's very deeply involved in this story, both financially and other ways. So, and the fact he's not agreed to speak kind of sends out a signal that he too is worried. So I think, we're going to have some interesting developments over the next few weeks.
And you wrote a really interesting piece this week on Substack, and it was something I hadn't picked up on actually when the emails were released last year. But basically, you lay out the evidence that Mandelson advised Epstein to stay away from Andrew, which seems quite astonishing. Can you just tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, I mean we've always assumed that Andrew cut links with Epstein because he was seen to be toxic. It looks like people realized that Andrew was a liability and began to distance themselves. So that very much changes the narrative. And of course, it puts Mandelson back center stage in the story, which I always thought he was. We got very little sense of Mandelson's relationship with Epstein or with Andrew, but Mandelson and Andrew were the two witnesses at the wedding of Lynn Forrester and Evelyn de Rothschild. And now these are key players. Lynn Forrester goes back in terms of her friendship with Epstein many years. There have been lots of rumors about her relationship with Andrew and with Clinton. She actually offered Andrew use of their apartment in New York to get him away from Epstein. And she's never spoken. I think she's very much a material witness here. And she should be asked to testify. But she's a very powerful networker, very close to Clinton. And so, I think that there are opportunities here for other people to be encouraged to speak out. But everyone clearly is absolutely terrified of saying anything, and they're presumably all going to plead the Fifth Amendment.
And another thing that you picked up on in a recent article was the hint within the Epstein files that Andrew may have given a character statement for Epstein during his initial trial for procuring a child for prostitution. What more do we know about that?
Well, we don't know that much, except that he was prepared to support his friend. I mean, this is the way that Andrew was used by Epstein to give respectability and to Epstein. He must have been aware of Epstein's proclivities. It seems an extraordinary thing to do to put his reputation on the line for Epstein. And I suspect there's going to be more of this sort of information coming to light in the next few weeks. But it seems an extraordinarily foolhardy thing to do, but it does suggest that that relationship was very, very close and very loyal.
There was also this reporting recently about Fergie having written the handbook for Epstein's household. Just take us through what that suggests and also just remind us of the way the Yorks treated their staff.
Yeah, one of the interesting disclosures is that there was a so-called English Duchess who wrote the sort of manual for how to treat guests and the Epstein properties. It does sound like it was Sarah Ferguson. I mean, some of the things that she was offering to guests are very much the sort of things that she offered to guests at Sunninghill, including condoms, for example, in the bathroom, but very expensive toiletries, very generous, very extravagant in terms of her hospitality, and that's contrasted with the way that she treated her staff, which was a bit like Meghan. I mean, huge turnover of staff, played off staff one against the other, was pretty bipolar in her dealings with staff. One moment they would be her best friend, the next she would be cutting them loose, rather like a sort of teenage girl, and some of them have remained quite loyal. I mean, I talked to Colin Tebbett, who was her driver, who had been the driver for Diana, very loyal still to her, but a huge turnover, particularly of nannies and cooks and things. I think you just got fed up with her behavior. And she was very demanding. She would often come back late and expect them to prepare meals for her. People had been working all day. She would ask them to prepare meals and then go out and not eat the meal. She would ask for several meals to be prepared, so she couldn't choose between them. She would ask people to come in and, I don't know, particularly on holiday, fill baths with ice and stuff, or get people at 4 o'clock to find a roast pig for dinner that night. I mean, she could be very demanding and difficult. And as a result of that, staff didn't really stay very long. But again, they all had very strict NDAs. They've been very reluctant to talk. I did talk to one who had stories about how she had been warned against Andrew, who was very handsy, particularly if you were giving people baths and things like that. There was stories of bugs in the staff quarters that they were actually putting their own staff under surveillance. So some pretty strange behavior for employers.
So you released a fascinating chapter from Entitled yesterday, which looked at the reality behind the Newsnight interview. Firstly, could you just give us an overview of what actually happened there? And can you also just start with talking about Beatrice's role in that interview?
Yes, well, I mean, the Newsnight interview is really with everything changed for Andrew. I mean, that was the sort of the nail in the coffin, and that's when he lost his basically his royal status. He'd been encouraged to do it by two people, really, Beatrice and by Amanda Thirsk, his secretary. Everyone else, including Jason Stein, his PR man, had said, "Don't do this." It broke all the rules of giving interviews, where you have prescribed limits, you have some control, you have people there and they seem to have allowed this very wide-ranging discussion. Now, the number of journalists have made their reputations off the back of the Newsnight interview, which was very well conducted by Emily Maitlis. And the story that's sort of been presented is that Newsnight have been trying to get this interview for months. The reality is that Newsnight have been talking to the Palace about an interview on Pitch at the Palace, not actually a particularly hard-hitting interview. And the people who'd really be doing the digging had been an offshoot of Panorama based in Ireland, a producer called Laura Burns, and working with someone called Dara McIntyre and the brother of Donald McIntyre. And they got this interview with Virginia Giuffre. Wanted to go to the palace to give them a right of reply. And I think the palace took the decision that, they had to sort of get this away from Panorama. And so they kind of said that they would do an interview with Newsnight. Now, Panorama and Newsnight then combined forces. Laura Burns then briefed Emily Maitlis, but this only happened 72 hours before the interview took place. So the stories of all these meetings and negotiations and stuff to bring this about didn't come from Newsnight. They actually came from Panorama. And I think the record needs to be set straight. Laura Burns got no credit in the program when awards were given and indeed film rights were sold. She and her team got no credit. She actually became pretty disillusioned with the BBC and left and now has a job outside television.
And how would you rate the BBC's willingness and success in investigating Andrew over the last 15 years?
Well, the BBC, are very proud of the Newsnight interview and claim that, they were the ones who kind of set Andrew on his decline. But the fact is that they were very nervous of anything. They had actually shut down various investigations. They were nervous of going certain places. And that's why it's interesting that it was an offshoot in Ireland rather than a body in London, for example, that was involved in this program. So I think they redeemed themselves, but eventually, there certainly wasn't a huge appetite to cover this story in the BBC beforehand.
So do you think the deference that's shown to the royal family is still very much in evidence at the BBC?
Yes, I think there's deference in all the institutions, whether it's the armed forces, the police, diplomatic service, civil service. It's very difficult to get any information about the royals. People won't talk. FOI requests have declined. To a large extent, they're seen as special, that the dignity of the monarchy will be affected by any sort of criticism. And my argument is the dignity of the monarchy relies on them behaving well, not by being protected. And in fact, if we have proper accountability and transparency, that will actually hold them to behave better. At the moment, they know they can get away with bad behavior, and so why should they behave properly? So I do hope that there's been a bit of a sea change since Andrew has had to step down from everything in the last few months, and that people will be more prepared to ask questions and to put them under scrutiny. And I think this is particularly true of Parliament. We have the Crown Estates being looked at by the Public Accounts Committee. Well, I hope they will do that properly. It isn't a whitewash. I do hope the Met Police will now actually look at some of the accusations leveled against Andrew, not least about his misconduct in public office by asking his protection officer to get the dirt on Giuffre. And that we do have a sense that they are not above the law and will be treated equally as any other citizen.
And do you think that in this new climate, if the police received new allegations, they would be more likely now than they would before to investigate and even potentially press charges?
Well, I had hopes that the Met would, under a new commissioner, under a new situation with all that pressure from social media and from the media, would perhaps, look again at some of their investigations, reopen some of them. And certainly, if people brought forward new information, I've offered information to the National Crime Agency, nothing's happened. I think there's a very strong case against both of them, Sarah Ferguson for abuse of charity laws, for example, and possibly things to do with Companies Act. And I think there's certainly a case against him, not just on sex trafficking, but on misconduct in public office and taking bribes. I mean, there's plenty of evidence of that and commissions. So I'm not hopeful, unfortunately, but I mean, you never know. Maybe pressure will be put on these institutions to do more than go through the motions.
And there was a brilliant documentary about the fake shake scandal on Channel 5 this week, and you were one of the contributors to that. Can you just remind us briefly about that scandal, but also talk about how it's potentially indicative of the entire York business model?
Yeah, I think it's probably the most damaging part of the whole York story. This was basically a recording of Sarah Ferguson by the News of the World in 2010, offering access to Andrew for large payments. I mean, £500,000. She took a down payment of £40,000 from them. She subsequently denied, I mean, it's all captured on tape, which you can see on YouTube, said that it was all she was set up. But the reason the News of the World had actually done this sting using this man called Masih Mahmood, the fake sheikh, was because there were lots and lots of stories of Fergie selling access to Andrew, particularly his role as a trade envoy in Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, going around. And so I don't think there's any doubt that this was in the public interest to do this sting. She did try and sue Mahmood later when he was sent to prison on a completely separate charge. But it was damaging. And I think it's a very good program because it kind of pulls things together. It shows how the PR machine responded to this. She gave a pretty cringing interview to Geordie Gregg, who's always been a great supporter of the royal family, in a paper. And it was one of the bits where she's now been caught out because she was making all sorts of claims about links with Epstein, which have subsequently been shown to be untrue, and that she'd broken contact. But as you piece the things together, you see the sting and you see the attempts subsequently to try and take the sting out of the sting, shall we say. She certainly went on Oprah very, very soon afterwards. She did documentaries about finding herself. She produced another book called Finding Sarah. So there was a big concerted campaign to try and distance herself from that, to draw a line in the sand and say she was a changed person. This wouldn't happen again. But of course it does, and that's always the problem, that she never learns from her mistakes. But it is damaging, and the fact it's been brought out again with many of the key individuals in the story, Paul McMullen and Paul Samurai, who I've never seen interviewed before. I think it's just more ammunition that's now being leveled against her as opposed to Andrew.
And what does it tell us about her role in the business of being the Yorks, as it were? Is she the kind of front person?
Yes, I think, everything is focused on Andrew, but I think she's kind of the brains behind Andrew. He's kind of just pointed in the right direction and then does what he's told. And he's clearly the one with the profile. But they certainly work very closely together. I know when they were in New York, the consulate there complained that she was always hanging around at events, getting herself invited to things that she wasn't invited to. They would have to find extra places for her at meals. She was busy picking up business cards from all sorts of people. She saw these when he was meant to be promoting British trade as an opportunity to promote herself and to get in there. And that's sort of what they've done with the children. I mean, that when they went on these trade trips, that's what was happening there too. They were being introduced to useful people, and those contacts are now being utilized. So, I mean, she was very much, an equal partner, even I would say one of the driving forces. I mean, she's the one who has, in some ways, much more need for money than Andrew. Well, she's the one who gets into debt and needs to find her way out of that. It was to pay Johnny O'Sullivan, one of her assistants, that they nobbled Epstein. So I think she's got away very lightly in everything. Everything's been focused on Andrew, when I think she's an equally important player in this story.
And how much more difficult will it be for them to carry on with these kinds of schemes now that she's no longer a duchess and he's no longer a prince or a duke?
Well, I think even without their titles, there are plenty of people who still believe that they're members of the royal family, still have some sort of kudos and contacts, particularly places like the Middle East and the Far East. So, and the Central Asian republics. So I think that these, and China even, I think these activities will continue, perhaps not as quite as extensively as before. It's interesting that she's closed a number of her companies, but it will just be a bit more under the radar. I don't think had a whole series of Chinese spies in their orbit. She worked very closely with a man called Johnny Hon, who paid her a large sum of money each year for being a director of one of his companies, which neither he nor she can explain. So, I think these people like Johnny Hon will remain loyal to her. They'll just be slightly more discreet about the way they operate. I mean, one of the things that Johnny Hon did with her was to use her as a bait to draw in Chinese investors to this company, Gate Ventures. The money then wasn't spent as it should have been done on entertainment projects, but actually helped subsidize one of her businesses, was used in expenses like lunches and paying to meet famous people and having sort of PE exercises with a supermodel and kind of frittered away. And I think a lot of these Chinese investors will not understand the difference in their particular status now and still will be, I'm afraid, rather gullible and easy targets for people like Johnny Hon.
And there's plenty of evidence in your book and also subsequent reporting that bears this out that both Andrew and Fergie were repeatedly warned about some of the characters that they were dealing with. No doubt they will still be repeatedly warned about some of the characters that they're going to deal with. Do you think they'll be more or less likely now to take those warnings on board?
Well, I think the interesting thing about both of them is they never seem to learn from the past. The Sarah Ferguson was warned about Steve Wyatt. I mean, 30 years ago, I mean, longer, and 35 years ago. And it was only when she ignored requests by the intelligence services to cut her links with Steve Wyatt that they planted the photographs, supposedly, of her and Wyatt, and that led to the scandal and him going home and actually triggered the calls for them to separate. And we've had this all the way through with various people that they were told not to associate with. And they've continued to do so. I'm sure the Chinese ambassador and Tenbo and all these people are still going to Andrew's birthday party. It'll be interesting to see how he does celebrate it next month.
And is there anything that the King or Prince William can do to prevent them from carrying on doing exactly what they've always done?
I think the king is in a difficult position because, they are could be loose cannons. They could, they know stuff that they could reveal, or he doesn't want them to get into a position where they're vulnerable, where they're in debt. So I think he will be paying them money. And he doesn't have a great deal of control over them except in terms of their daughters. And if he is paying them some sort of a stipend. So, his options are limited. And, in some ways, he's better keeping them inside the tent than outside the tent, though he knows that clearly that doesn't play well with the public. And if he gets too close to them and they get up to mischief, he's compromised. If he is very ruthless with them, he can be seen to be vindictive and difficult. And so it's a tricky one for him. And I think he hasn't quite worked out how to get the balance right. I think for William and Catherine, it's much more clear cut. These are damaging the reputation of the monarchy. That is all it's about. And they need to be neutralized. And whether that is again a mixture of pressure and patronage, then they will do whatever's necessary to shut them up.
What kind of cards do Andrew and Fergie hold? And what kind of damage could they do to, say, Charles and Camilla?
Well, I'm sure they know lots of secrets about Diana and Charles and Camilla. Fergie knows lots of stories about Andrew and vice versa. They may well have other gossip about other members of the royal family. They may have things that they can say about Prince Philip, for example, and his extramarital affairs. So, I mean, a lot of this is, could be very, very damaging, and they can be, leaked in a very subtle way, so their fingers are not on it. And I think that must be the worry that they could call the shots if people aren't treating them properly. So I think there will be quiet deals done behind the scenes. We've seen negotiating in public, threats that they're going to sell letters to the Queen or from Diana, all this sort of stuff. It's one of the concerns they had when the Duke of Windsor died, that there would be artifacts, personal artifacts and letters that would go public. And Mountbatten was sent to try and recover this stuff. In fact, I think 3 lorry loads of material, both archives and furniture, were removed from the house in the Bois de Boulogne. So I think, that must be a great concern. They may know lots of stories about William and Harry's relationship, William and Harry's personal lives. they've been there, Fergie, both of them, for 40 years. And I think the rumors that Fergie's kept a diary. So, there are all these implicit threats, which I think probably carry some validity.
And we know Andrew isn't close to William or Harry. Indeed, you mentioned in your book that Harry had thumped him. What do we know about William and Harry's relationship with Fergie?
They don't like her. They think certainly William doesn't like her. I think, he thinks she's pretty cheap, that she's taken advantage of her position. She's an embarrassment. I think Harry, I think, is annoyed because Fergie's got away with behavior that he and Meghan would like to try, the half in, half out, and feel that there's been double standards here. So I don't think there's a great deal of love lost, between Harry and William and the Yorks, full stop. I think there may be some residual loyalty because of the children. I think because of Harry and Eugenie's relationship. But even that, I think, is probably a little bit more distant than it was.